Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, Joanna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead. My guest today is astrological magician and geomancer Bellatrix Rose. Our discussion was a lovely one, touching on her views on meeting and beginning work with the geomantic figures, as well as a little of her advice on getting started with the art and thinking with geomancy and astrology together in both divinatory and magical contexts. I just returned from presenting a workshop on divination at the first annual Plant Cunning Conference, hosted by Isaac and AC at their beautiful farmstead in New York State. If you do not already know the Plant Cunning podcast, you should absolutely check it out. It was an honor and a pleasure to be present with the other workshop presenters and the other panelists and all the people who took part in that beautiful conference on their land. And it capped what has been a rather hectic but wonderful summer for me and brought me full circle back into presenting and speaking about divination in herbal and magical contexts. I couldn't be more thrilled to have this lovely interview, recorded earlier this year, ready to send out to you all now as we start to move closer to fall and the autumn equinox. And I hope you enjoy it. Before we dive in, if you do enjoy our content, please subscribe to the podcast, share it with your friends, and leave us a good review on Apple Podcasts. Coffee and Divination's Patreon page, which is very new and will have a lot more content added as we move into the winter this year, as well as more information about the show, can always be found on our website at coffeeanddivination.com. So thank you so much for joining us today. It is my pleasure to have Bellatrix Rose on here as a guest, one of a number of guests that we have had on focusing on geomancy, which I am very happy to see growing in popularity and in acclaim these days in the occult world. I think that it is long past time that it is being recognized again, since it has such an incredibly vast history of use and practice. So Bellatrix here is a friend of another guest that many people know from the show, Ivy. And it is my pleasure to welcome her as our guest today. So thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So we have there's always, every show I feel has some sort of traditional first question. Mine is not very difficult, I think, but I always love to talk to people about their background. And my first question is, what was your first entry point into divination? Was it something that you were around at all as a child? Did you have family members who practiced astrology or read cards? Or was it something that you came to and you were the one who was like, actually, I'm very interested in this kind of occult things or divination related things?
Well, astrology is something I've always been interested in, and I kind of came to that on my own, especially when traditional astrology started to become more popular. I discovered the astrology podcast years ago and kind of have never looked back, because once you find that type of astrology, it just has a really interesting flavor in comparison to sort of the sun sign stuff that you see as a kid. Um, but I also I married a man who was raised Wiccan, and his parents are very wonderful, lovely people. They're also Capricorns. So it was, when you meet them, they're very grounded and down to earth and, for lack of a better word, normal. And it was my first experience really meeting people who were Wiccan. And though that's not quite the path that I ended up taking, it kind of opened me up to the idea that, that it wasn't a bunch of kooky nonsense, and that you could be an adult and be just a normal person and also practice magic.
That's beautiful. So that entryway through your relationship with your husband and his family, was that what you would consider, outside of the astrology podcast, was that kind of your first foray into the occult realms? Was at that point? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's very
And
interesting.
so, yeah, I just started reading up on it and exploring, and I would say I wouldn't call myself a witch necessarily, or Wiccan, but I definitely am very highly interested in the occult and in magic. I love folk magic and other kinds of things like that. Um, but when I stumbled upon geomancy, it was sort of like falling in love a little bit because it has a lot of the same characteristics as astrology, but it's also more practical in a lot of ways. And you can use astrology in practical ways, but I feel like there's something that's concrete about geomancy.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's something that I've heard from a number of my friends who also have been taken by geomancy lately, is that practicality which has been there for a long time. So if I was someone, because we do have some listeners who are probably new to geomancy, some who practice it or know more about it, but others are kind of new. And it's always interesting to hear how one person describes something, because I feel like that is always interesting, what words we choose to describe something. If you were at a cocktail party and someone said, I don't know, I know tarot cards, but I don't know this geomancy thing, how would you describe it to someone who is new to it?
In a way, geomancy is almost like if astrology and tarot had a baby, because you've got the sortilege with tarot, and then you've got a lot of the terms, the houses are involved in geomancy, and the planets are all there. Um, so that's kind of how I would like to describe it.
Hmm. Absolutely. So for your practice, did you find that when you were first drawn to geomancy that you went into studying astrology in order to better understand geomancy, or kind of what was your route in? Do you feel that
I,
people are more drawn to astrology through geomancy, or the other way around?
I think that you could go either way. I was already very familiar with astrology when I discovered geomancy, which made geomancy really simple for me to learn because the concepts were already there and you use it in a lot of the same ways. The houses are basically the same, especially to traditional astrology. If you look at modern astrology, it's a little bit different. But to horary and traditional, the houses are really similar. And so you've kind of already got the lexicon there, and you can just sort of start developing your knowledge on geomancy from there.
So if someone comes to you with a question, I mean, what is your preferred method of working with geomancy? Because I know that there's a number of different, there are people that work with it, using the methods of having like geomancy cards, or stabs or things of that nature, or going back to pen and paper, or even stick and earth. What do you do in order to cast a geomancy chart? And if you could kind of describe that a little bit for people, because I feel like sometimes it's a little hard for people to understand how you get to these figures.
Sure. You can get to the figures through any form of sortilege that will give you an even or an odd. And so my favorite way to do it is with a consecrated coin. And I just like to flip a coin. And you do that 16 times and you get your figures. And it sounds like it would take um, a little more time, and it does, but I like to ritualize my experience.
Yes, absolutely. So that consecrated coin then giving you that the time to sort of make sure that you're getting them in an orderly fashion that isn't necessarily instantaneous, but it is still quick. You mentioned that you don't call yourself necessarily a witch. When you say that it's consecrated, I obviously don't mean for you to ask you to share things that perhaps you don't want to share on the show, but is there anything about your ritual technique, or what spirits you think of working with when you sit down to do a reading? Is this something where you have dedicated spirits that are more from like a ceremonial magic background, or just something else entirely? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I like to work with a range of spirits. I like to tell people I'm sort of in between gods at the moment. But I do like to work with a range of spirits. I like to work with planetary spirits and saints and angels. And so in this case, it's planetary and also just the spirits that are the figures of geomancy as well.
So for those who are or less familiar, can you give us a couple, perhaps you could, what I think would be very interesting, since you're mentioning the spirits of the figures, can you give us an example of one of those figures and sort of the spirit or the ways in which you interact with what's behind that particular figure if something comes up very strongly in a chart? Because I think that geomancy is interesting, and I like to point this out to people that geomancy is one of the forms of divination where you can receive the same figure multiple times in a chart, which sometimes if you're doing a tarot reading, it's like, well, there's only one, empress in the deck. So
Yeah.
you can't get it in multiple positions, whereas with geomancy, you can. So I think that sometimes makes the figuration different. Could you like talk us through something about one of the figures or how you think of that process?
Definitely. And one of the figures, for instance, is Puer, and Puer is a martial figure. And one thing that I do a little bit differently than some other geomancers is some geomancers will associate the figures with the zodiac. And to me, I feel that none of it doesn't really quite fit. And so I don't use the zodiac when I'm working with the figures. I just work with them in their planetary sense. Um, but so Puer is very much like a Mars direct sort of figure. And a thought experiment that I've kind of been playing with is talking about if um, the geomantic figures were pop culture figures, who would they be? And to me, Puer would be Ash from Ash versus Evil Dead. So if you're familiar with that show at all, his motto was shoot first, ask questions never. And he is very much a puer type of figure. He's kind of a romantic. I mean, he did release the Evil Dead onto the world because he was trying to impress a girl. Um, he's very much he's got that machismo type of attitude, but he's also really good at one thing, and that is sending the evil dead back, and very warrior martial type of thing. So he to me is like a really good puer type of figure.
Absolutely. And that I think that it's interesting because sometimes with these figurations that are I will include for the video version, I will put a couple of images of some of these geometric figures so people can see a little bit what we're talking about, because sometimes it helps if you are kind of new to these figurations what to see what they look like. But they're not picture cards. They're not, kind of even from like Marseille or we're kind of, if we're talking about people who are used to oracle cards or tarot cards that have some degree of figuration, these do not have that. Not that that's unique. There's lots of other forms of divination that don't. But then being able to give people a way in to finding that spirit is very helpful and useful. Do you find that you have kind of come to that interpretation of these figurations simply through the way you've seen them answer other people's questions, or have you done like forms of journey work to speak with them, or what's your methodology of kind of getting inside of one of these figures, since they're not necessarily as visual as people may think?
Yeah, I've definitely done a lot of journey work with each of the figures. I feel like that's really the best way to get to know them on a more in-depth and nuanced level. Just spending time in meditation and journey and ritual, just kind of almost going to where they would be and see what it would be like to interact with them. And they aren't pictorial, but they do kind of almost make a figure sometimes. Like puer is the dot is 1, 1, 2, 1. And so some people call it like the sword. I think John Michael Greer in one of his books mentions that it's sort of like exaggerated testicles. And I can never get that out of my head now.
There are definitely images that, yes.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and that's very interesting. So you have been working with the geomantic figures within sort of a context of answering people's questions and also journeying with them. Did you start, I'm assuming that you started just first by reading for yourself. Was
Yes.
that kind of what your original thing was? How did you get pulled into reading for other people? I'm always interested what motivates people to then kind of branch out.
Part of it is the readings are so incredibly accurate, that I would just talk about it a lot. And the more I would talk about it, people get interested, and then people want to get a reading, and then that's successful, and it just sort of snowballs from there. I can even tell you about one of the very first charts I ever did, and so I wasn't very experienced yet. I literally just took a regular coin, not anything consecrated, in my kitchen, just experimenting. And I had a question about a new friend that I had met. And what I ended up, the answer I got, because I was asking about, how will this friendship be? I was just coming up with a question, basically. And I got Fortuna Minor, which is sort of a figure of like fate, easy come, easy go. And it was great because she ended up being a great friend for about a month, and then she moved away.
Yeah.
So, and it's like, even before you ritualize it, you still get a lot of really accurate contexts. And the more you get into it, the more you can find the details. And the more you learn, the more you ritualize it. It's really fascinating to me how well it works.
I remember there was a time that I did a geomancy reading for myself about a trip, and I kept getting the figure where you're supposed to, essentially it's telling you to stop doing the reading. And that's one of my questions
Oh,
coming up to you,
yeah.
is whether you follow that rule, because I've spoken
Hmm.
to you about that. And I got that. I was like, but I'm reading for myself, so that must just be silly. Of course, the trip was canceled for reasons I could not have known about at that moment. But it was really just saying, like, there's really nothing to do a reading on because the trip
Yeah.
isn't going to happen. So it was one of those,
Hmm.
I always go back to that moment and go, yeah, yeah, that trip was not going to happen. So it couldn't do a reading for me on the outcome of it. So can you tell people about that, about how there are some interesting rules around geomancy, and, whether you are telling the truth to the person reading for you or whether the reading should be
Hmm.
stopped? What are your views on that?
Yes, there's some great rules, and I love them. I would say, 'cause there's two figures that can fall in the first house, and it means you're supposed to stop the reading. And it's Cauda Draconis and Rubius. And when it comes to Rubius, if I get that, I will usually just stop the reading, because it just doesn't seem to be worth my time to move forward. I will sometimes use another form of divination to see if anything else needs to be done, if there's something, surrounding the issue that is blocking the answer. Um, in which case, I'll make further recommendations. But I don't look at it in necessarily like a superstitious sort of way. I just see it as the reading is telling me not today. When it comes to Cauda Draconis, that one, I usually won't stop the reading, but I will read with using another form of divination about it when it first comes up. I'll stop for a moment when I get that first figure and just say, you know, is this person in danger? Because sometimes they are, and maybe we need to go further with that and make some other recommendations before I even move forward. But more often than not, it usually means that the person has already made up their mind about what's going to happen, and that's fine. Or maybe they've had something really traumatic happen to them, and maybe I need to now approach this in a more gentle way. And that's a really great way to look at it. The first house is so important. What comes up can really tell you how to deliver the answer as well. But
That's interesting.
yeah, there's lots of other rules like that. Like if a missio comes up in the first house, usually the client has forgotten to tell you something.
Hmm. Interesting. That one I didn't know.
It's the figure of loss. So
Yeah.
that's a really great one. You can stop and say, now, is there anything else that you have forgotten? But it can also mean that the person is sad as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, for my canceled trip one, it was Rubius. So it was one where should have stopped reading at that point, but didn't because thought, oh, no, I'll continue. But it is really interesting. And I think that part of that comes from there is an enormous amount of history behind the practice of geomancy, which is interesting for people to sort of be rediscovering that today. And it was enormously, I don't know, popular is the word. I suppose popular is the right word. Um, but it fell into lack of favor for probably a number of different reasons. One of which was that it started to become kind of rote or formulaic.
Yeah.
And I feel like that is something that could happen with any form of divination. But what do you feel about the potential downside of the figures sort of coming to be too associated with only one interpretation? Like how do you factor that into when you're reading for things and why that happened in the past?
Yeah, if you look through a lot of the older writings on geomancy, there are lots of lists for what each figure means in each house. And I think that it's actually a great starting point. It's it's a piece of information that you can add to your list of what you know about those figures, because each figure is going to behave differently in each house. But beyond that, having a more personal relationship with the figures, using your journey work and other types of methods like that, or just creative imaginary work in some way to really create a more full and rich version of the figures, then imagining those figures in different parts of a person's life, that will actually give you a better answer than just a one sentence, evil except for bloodletting or something like that.
Or yes, I think there's one that's good except in the case of buying a horse or something. And it's
Yeah.
like, well, I mean, I am potentially going to buy a horse this summer, so that's why I bring that up. Because I'm like, oh, well, that's a time when that necessarily may come into play for a reading for
Yeah.
me.
And be, oh, it's great. You should buy this horse.
Yeah, less so usually for people these days.
Yeah.
No, that's interesting. And I think that, I mean, that could be said of a lot of different forms of divination, anytime it gets to a sort of rote version, but because of the sort of mathematical combinations that are possible with it, I think that's potentially where that came from. How do you, uh, are there other intricacies about, I know there are things like the paths of fortune and the ways that people think of like the judgment and what comes of that. Can you tell us a little bit about what some of the, outside of just knowing the numbers of the houses and the placement of the houses within sort of astrological context, there are a couple of other intricacies that are specific to geomancy. Can you maybe choose one that you think is particularly interesting and tell us a little about that? Because I think
Uh,
that's interesting for people like myself too. So
Definitely. So, yeah, I really like to work with the index and the part of fortune. And the index, I think it's Sam Block who also likes to call it the part of spirit, which kind of makes it behave more like astrology concepts. And the meanings are kind of very similar when you're looking at the part of fortune and the part of spirit. The part of fortune kind of gives you the practical things that need to be done. The part of spirit gives you the more spiritual things that can be done. And so it's really there's usually when you use that type of method, it gives you a lot more nuance. You can also work with the figures by adding figures together, different figures together to get more answers. And that's another really great way to get lots of nuance in a reading.
Mhm.
So for
Yeah.
instance, if you're wanting to know about your mom, your mom is ruled by the 10th house. So you could add the first and the 10th house together and get a third figure and see what that figure is. And that will tell you about your relationship with her in regards to this question.
Mhm. Yeah. That really does kind of come back to the point that we've been circling around since the very beginning of the interview, which is the connection to astrology and how that nuanced view of traditional astrology and especially the knowledge of the houses, is potentially crucial for really a deeper knowledge of geomancy. And you mentioned the astrology podcast. I 100%, 110%, also agree. That's a fantastic resource. And please go check out that podcast if you don't already know it. Are there other resources, or what else helped you to develop that knowledge of astrology? Are there other authors or other ways into astrology that you think are particularly helpful for people if they are saying, well, I know I need to know more about this in order to be better at geomancy? What do you think is a good way in for people?
Definitely Demetra George has a book on traditional astrology that is fantastic and a really good introduction. It kind of takes you one step at a time to really learn all of it. Also, if you're learning traditional astrology, Austin Coppock teaches classes, and he's fantastic. I really enjoy his teaching style as well.
Yes. No, I can completely concur on that. I will try to, as long as I remember, I will put that in my notes to put that in the show notes as well so that people have links, because I think that is important. Because sometimes I think it is a little intimidating because it's with other forms of divination, you can say, oh, but I have a little white book and I could just look up what the meaning is. And look, I know now what judgment is. But with geomancy, you do have that placement in a chart, which means that right off the bat, there is no just looking for a single meaning, because everything about where it is placed makes such a big difference on what the answer is, which means you need to pay more attention to position and astrology in order to get that. With that being said, all of this kind of plays into, you mentioned originally that you have an interest in folk magic and witchcraft and, this connection to Wicca on some level. When you're working with clients, are there ways that you will advise people to incorporate magic or other practices, depending on their background, obviously? But if they're open to that, of influencing fate, like ways that you see these practices as still allowing for the room to influence fate, how do you see that as tying into geomancy?
Absolutely. To me, if there's almost no point to me doing divination if you can't do anything of it. That's
agree.
my personal thoughts on that. And I take a lot of the remediation that comes from traditional astrology. You can do planetary remediation. And so if a figure falls and you know the planet, then you can do traditional planetary remediation. You can also do things because I like to do a lot of folk magic. There's a lot of little things that you can do for each figure that make a lot of sense to me.
Can you give us an example, please?
Let me see. So Conjunctio is sort of a crossroads figure. And so depending on, it's going to change based on the chart and what's needed. But usually it will have something to do with the crossroads, whether that be taking a petition to the crossroads, or maybe you're doing some work first at home and then burying at a crossroads or something like that. It just kind of depends on the nature of the question, and then where in the house, what house it's falling in, what house it springs to, all of that kind of stuff.
Yes. So, kind of in a sense, you're looking at the way in which the question is answered for advice on what type of magic or what magical act would be most appropriate to take.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
If you ask your questions correctly, and the question is so important, but if you ask it well, you can get the answer to what kind of magic you should be doing within your question.
So, how do you define a well-asked versus a not so well-asked question? Because I think that was all, of course, on my question list of things to ask you. So it's perfect, perfect that you bring it up.
People love to come to you and say, I want to do this thing. Will it be good for me? And my answer to that is, how do you define good? let's start with what good means to you. Does good mean being successful? Does good mean being able to pay your bills? Does good mean public recognition? Does good mean happiness? And then if you go further than that, what don't you want? If you get this, will it take up all your time and then you don't have time for your family? If you get this, will you be super wealthy but miserable? Or whatever, and so then a better question would be, considering that I would like to be able to pay my bills and have public recognition and be happy and spend time with my family and blah, 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 blah. And I don't want all these other things. Will this be good for me?
Indeed. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So do you feel that that is the same as how you would ask a question of another form of divination, or are there ways that you particularly tweak questions for geomancy? Or you think it's really a
Yeah.
good question is a good question?
A good question is a good question. However, with geomancy, because there's so many different techniques, I will often ask it, sometimes houses can mean more than one thing. So I will sometimes in the question say, and since the seventh house will mean this in this reading, because the seventh house could be me, it can be the reader, but it can also be a different other. So may the seventh house also show this, and that's a great way to make sure that that is part of the question.
So you phrase it in almost as if, and I like that. I'm not saying this is a bad thing at all. There's kind of like a definition of terms involved in the question. So
Yeah.
Sounds a little legalistic to some people, perhaps, but it does mean that then you're defining your terms before the question is asked, so that there's no lack of clarity afterwards of like, oh, wait, what was that referring to? Which sometimes can be a problem. Yeah.
Well, and I forget the exact quote, but Aleister Crowley said that the geomantic spirits were tricksome spirits that delight in fooling you, basically, as a paraphrase. And I think certainly some of them are. So, yeah, I think almost approaching it in a legal way, the way you would if you were doing work with a spirit in conjuration, is a great way to make sure that you've got all your I's dotted and your T's crossed, and just get your question really, really well set, and your answers will be more detailed and rich versus an answer that it might be true, but you're not getting the whole story.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because with different forms of divination, I've asked this with different people as well, where there's this feeling of whether the spirits are answering the question that you kind of should have asked, or the question that you literally asked. And it sounds to me like with geomancy, and with my limited practice with geomancy, I think that there is sort of a literality. Well, is that even a word?
Yeah.
Yes. A sort of literalness about, you asked exactly this, therefore that's the exact answer to the question you'll get, versus what we know what you meant was this, therefore we're going to answer that instead.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that kind of?
100%. Yeah. Geomancy will give you the answer to the question you asked, not the questions that, it knows you should have asked. And it knows what question you should have asked.
Yeah, that's very interesting. When you advise people about remediation, you mentioned crossroad spirits. Are there times when you might suggest that people actually go and, because as we're talking about these figures as spirits, are there times when you say that there are times when you'd want to go and work, or have a client or a person go and work with the spirit themselves? Or is it something where it's just them giving advice about the type of magic or other spirits they should engage with?
Yeah, it's going to depend on the client and their practice and what they're comfortable with. Because I get a wide range of folks, and some people have a really developed practice and are comfortable doing lots of magic, and some people are sort of just magic adjacent and kind of curious. And depend. I mean, I don't know if I would send that person out to go deal with a crossroads spirit.
Definitely depends. Yes. Yeah.
So yeah, depending on what you're comfortable with and familiar with, and different people have different practices, and there's different types of crossroad spirits. So if you have a crossroad spirit that is in your practice, well, that's probably what the figures are referring to. They're probably telling you, oh, you should go work with your crossroad spirit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So in that case, if you are advising people about first getting started in this, I have plenty of other questions about the professional side of it, of what you do for clients. But if people are curious about this, what do you think some of the best entry practices are for them? You mentioned journey work, but just in getting started, what were some things that helped you when you were first beginning with this style?
Besides journey work, meditation is really important, and having a really solid, being able to develop a really solid ritual space as well. Because I do think it's important to do this within ritual space. You'll just get better results. Um, but also, if it's about learning about geomancy, John Michael Greer has a really excellent book on geomancy. He has several excellent books on geomancy. So those are probably the best starting point and access point into it. And I think it would be good if more people knew at least a little bit about geomancy, because then I don't have to explain as much in the session.
No, absolutely. It does make a difference, I'm sure. Um, when it comes to that relationship building through the divination that you're doing, you mentioned that there are times when you will go to a second form of divination. Is that tarot? Is that something else? Are there particular styles of divination that when you see something come up in a reading, you're like, oh, well, I should really probably go to this particular deck to get some help? What do you partner with usually?
My favorite is just cartomancy, divination with playing cards, because I feel like they partner really well. Playing cards are also very down to earth and blunt. And so the two together just seem to mesh well. So if there's any reason that I need to combine them in some way, they just seem to work really well together.
Yeah, and playing card divination is, I feel, really just a beautiful thing for everyone, whether you want to just do straight up rider waite or not. You should also read with playing cards because they're just both informative and also, I think, influence then how you work with other decks as well. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And it's
Um,
fun. You could be at a party and say, hey, would you like me to read your fortune? All other people.
always a good test. Very,
Yeah.
very much. A very excellent test. Um, yeah. So with that, when you are reading for people, you said that the art of asking a good question is obviously key, and I couldn't agree more with that. Do you feel that you spend a certain amount of time with clients helping them get to the bottom of their questions, or do you just take questions as they come and say, well, we'll see what they say, and then try to ask like a second or a third question to add on to that? Sort of, is it like you try to do one question to rule them all,
I like
or
one
do you?
question to rule them all. Yes. I usually will spend a good amount of time, and it depends on the client and the question. But 15 minutes is probably like the minimum that you should be spending discussing the situation. Sometimes you can spend 30 minutes and then really get down to it. But that's usually if it's a really complicated question. 15 minutes is usually pretty good. You can get to a pretty good idea of what the question should be in that amount of time.
And you mentioned sometimes partnering with cartomancy. Is that something that you feel you do only when like some special issue comes up? Or because I've spoken to some people who are like, well, and then I like to check my results with something else. Or do you only do that in the case of something very strange coming up or something particularly concerning coming up?
Is usually if it's just something particularly concerning coming up.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah.
Although sometimes you can look at a chart and just weird, it'll just be a weird chart. And I like to what is this? And so I like to sometimes use the cards to ask, am I seeing this the way I should be seeing this?
Yeah.
And the cards will, if they're telling me yes or no, that just gives me a little bit more information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. With the geomantic figures themselves, are there contexts where you will end up, perhaps this is only in your own private practice or with other people that you know are geomantic practitioners who have experience with the spirits themselves, not necessarily what you would tell a client to do, but are there times when you will get something in a reading and then go directly to the spirit of that figure to try to do magic with them in order to influence it, or to let's say you get something very, very good that you want to confirm, would you then go to that figure in order to confirm it? Or is it something that is purely informational and then you would go to other spirits or gods or, demigods to do more work on?
And I actually think the geomantic figures are great to partner with as spirits to, especially if you get a chart you really like. Your chart can actually almost become like a talisman for what you want to achieve, and you can use it in a working. You can take those figures and do things with it if you wanted to. You could put sigils on it. You can put it on your altar. You can call the spirits and work with them. Yeah, you could, if you don't like it, you could burn it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And there's lots of things that you can do with the chart. And it's not in every case. Sometimes your chart is, it's this or that. It's not great. It's not bad. It's just
Not necessarily the greatest or the worst thing you've ever seen. So yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, kind of like treating it as a potential talisman if it is something really, really that you think could be a powerful tool for working towards that goal. Yeah, that's
Absolutely.
very,
Mm-hmm.
very interesting. Yeah. Are there times when you have, I mean, it sounds like what drew you to geomancy was how successful you've been with it. But I
Yeah.
also like to ask people about things that have not worked for them. Are there times when you found that it hasn't worked for you, or you've been too close to a situation in order to answer it? Or do you feel like these figures, you said they are very blunt, and I agree with my limited experience with them. I would agree that they are quite blunt. So is it the kind of thing where this style of divination, you get the answer? Or do you feel like sometimes you need to outsource and say, hey, hello, friend, can you read for me instead?
Yeah. There's definitely times when I think outsourcing is a good idea, especially if you're not feeling well, if you are it just even just being stressed out can cause you to have a hard time finding the answer, and the answer is probably there and you're just not seeing it. And for me, that would just be really rare. I really haven't had to deal with that very much, but sometimes when you're too close to your own things and it's a stressful situation, it is a good idea to have another geomancer um, read for you, or even just look at your chart and say, you know, you can say, here's what this is the shield I pulled, and this is the house chart, and it looks weird, and I'm not seeing the answer. And sometimes someone else has more insight.
Yeah. I'm a huge believer in talking these things through with other people because it can make a big difference. Not to say that you can't read for yourself, but that sometimes through the act of it can really help have clarity. So with that, all of that being said, are there contexts when you feel that geomancy is not the form of divination to go to? Because it's always wonderful to know the strengths of the forms of divination, just like it is like the strengths of the types of magic that we use. And sometimes it's not the right thing for a situation, even if it is like usually our go-to. Are there things that you would say, maybe you go to something else for that?
Yeah, it's probably two different situations. One would be if you just need a quick answer, like a really quick answer. For me, because of the way that I do geomancy, it takes a long time to put a chart together, and it would be a lot quicker to flip some cards over it. Um, and if it's just a kind of a yes or no quick answer, and you don't need any nuance or anything like that. You can just go somewhere else for it. Also, if you want something a little more, see, I feel like tarot is really good if you want something a little bit more psychological, and you want to know, what's going on like a soul level and stuff like that, and get like the flowery details of things. Tarot is good for that stuff, and so geomancy is not flowery. um,
Yes.
so yeah, in most cases, it's my preferred method, though.
Yeah. No, absolutely. That makes sense. When it comes to how often you read, this is something that I always find interesting to ask people, particularly people who read professionally or, at least read a great deal. Do you find that you are reading for yourself very regularly or only when you have very specific questions? Like, how do you feel? Perhaps also a second question that is, if people are new to this, how often do you feel they should be doing this? Because there's sometimes, I know we all have this beginner, we get excited about something. We're like, I'm going to do this all the time, which is great. I think it's a wonderful stage to be in. But what do you think is like a healthy amount, or what has worked for you in terms of your relationship with reading?
Sure. I read for myself generally once a week. And I think that that's a good, healthy amount. Initially, I was reading every day for myself. And I think that's probably great when you're first starting to kind of learn about it. Um, and it's the way I would do it is you don't want to just say, sort of like with tarot, like, show me today, because that's not a great way to get a good answer out of geomancy. But what you can say is, show me something so that I learn something new about geomancy today.
It's a very
And
different question, yeah.
yes, and yeah, give me an answer that helps me learn more about geomancy today, and that will actually give you some really interesting insights into things.
So you're divining to get better at divination. I like
Yeah.
that. It's a feedback loop of getting better at the thing that you're doing to get better at the thing. That is very, very interesting. Yeah, I like that. Um, you mentioned that you have a ceremonial sort of coin that is consecrated that you work with. Are there any particular prayers to particular spirits that you can share? And it's totally fine if it is not. Are there any prayers or rituals that you find important around your practice? Like certain things like reciting prayers to certain spirits, or is it something where it is a quality of focus that you get?
It's definitely prayers, and the prayers have changed over the years as I've been working with it. Initially, I just did a lot of prayers to my own spirits that I work with. But very recently, Dr. Alexander Cummins came out with a new book, Nazareth, Pillars of Gladness. And there are prayers within it to work with the geomantic spirits. And I have found them to be very effective in my work.
It's beautiful. I
Mm-hmm.
will definitely, yes, uh, include that in the show notes for people who are curious, as I think that is a wonderful recommendation and very good. As we're kind of drawing to a close, are there things that you think people should keep in mind? I obviously have a podcast about divination, so I think divination is a very important thing, or I wouldn't have this podcast. Um, how do you think that is there any advice that you would give people about engaging with divination, or engaging specifically with geomancy, that you think would be advice that you want to give people, things that you think you'd like to share with them about these things and the reasons you practice it?
Well, part of the reason I practice it is because I love it.
Always a good sign. Always the best sign.
There's just something about it that is just fascinating and fun. But I really think that divination in general just like you can use divination to improve your divination, you can use it to improve your magic. and you can use it to improve your life. You can, I use divination, I don't use divination as the end all be all. When I draw a chart, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to listen. I usually regret that, but I see it as a piece of information, sort of like intel into how I should be framing my decisions. And that to me is a really healthy way to look at divination, so that you're not letting it rule your life, because that's also important. But using it sort of like advice from someone who's really smart and knows a lot of things.
Knows a lot and has seen a lot, probably. So therefore, if we can interpret it, yes. I think that's beautiful advice. And I think I really appreciate your insight into this. I think that I am excited to send people to you if they are interested in your work. What can you tell us about what you do for people and where they can find you? Because I want to make sure people know about you and where to get more about you.
Absolutely. I give readings, full shield and house chart readings on my website at cunningandcraft.com. And you can also find me on Instagram at cunningandcraft as well.
That is lovely. I will be sure to include all of that in the show notes. I'd love to have you on again. This has been a fascinating conversation. And yeah, I really do appreciate your time and all that you are sharing with people. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you so much. This has been so much fun having a chat with you today.
Black moon above, stars overhead. Don't you dare go